Good afternoon to everyone who has joined the webinar. Thanks for your time, and we will start our webinar very soon. But first, I would like to give a short introduction about myself, and also later on I will introduce our speaker for today. So my name is Teresa. I'm currently the Regulatory Affairs Senior Manager at Food Industry Asia, and at the same time, I'm also the Program Lead for the ASEAN Food and Beverage Alliance, AFBA. So today's webinar is jointly organized by both Food Industry Asia as well as AFBA. So let's move to the next slide. So here you would be able to see a rough outline of the program for today. So the main part would be a presentation by Myers, who is the international trade expert and the guidebook author. And after that, we would have a short time of Q&A, and we would close after that. So if, let's say, you have any questions, please feel free to put the questions to the speaker using the question. There's a question box on your panel, so you'll be able to submit the questions, and once we see that, we'll be able to have a short discussion after the presentation. And next slide, please. Just click one more time, me. Yeah, so I'll just share some background as to the work that we are doing around trade. So as most of you might be aware, be it members from Food Industry Asia, or also members from AFBA, who are the members of the National Industry Associations in the region, we have been advocating for the interests of the food industry in the region especially, and here are some of the top priorities that we have been focusing on, such as labeling, including nutrition labeling, product registration, halal. So we have been engaging with various stakeholders on all these different non-tariff measures. And in the recent 1 or 2 years, we have been considering broadening our areas of focus into trade, as we do see some close links between non-tariff measures and also the ongoing trade negotiations. So we felt that it's a good platform for us to leverage on to highlight the concerns around non-tariff measures, and with that, we are able to also diversify our engagement platforms while at the same time driving forward the same message of harmonization or standardization of food standards and requirements in the region. So currently, we are still in a phase of building up our understanding and knowledge in terms of trade developments. And recently, we heard a lot about various trade agreements, such as like RCEP and other ASEAN +1 FTAs. And we, even as we go through these stock take exercise, we wanted to assess as well what are the potential impacts of these new regional trade developments to the food sector. So on one hand, we want to, our key interest is to address the NTMs, but at the same time, we also want to equip the food industry to leverage on the benefits from these various trade agreements. And with that, we are also in the midst of developing a comprehensive strategy and work plan as well to see how all these tie in together, even as we continue to work closely with our various partners from the food sector, such that we are able to provide our feedback as well to the various trade ministries, and to advance our primary objectives around harmonization. And next slide. Okay, and just click one more time. So as mentioned, we are in the midst of building up that understanding around trade, and just getting more in-depth knowledge, and at the same time starting to be involved in the discussion with the various stakeholders around like trade negotiations or the drafting of trade agreements. So here you would see our recent works and also some of the ongoing works. For example, last year we had launched RCEP report. So knowing that this is quite a landmark agreement, we wanted to distill out some of the key aspects that are relevant to the food sector. So that report was launched last year, and currently we have a monthly regional trade monitoring report whereby we keep track of the various trade negotiations or any new developments that are happening between the key markets in the APAC region, and how does it impact the food and beverage industry. And last but not least, today we have this launch of business guidebook, and we see like all these things happening, and we hope that this could be useful toolkits to our industry members, and knowing, getting more familiarity with the various trade facilitation mechanisms and what are the existing benefits that can be that industry can benefit from. And last but not least, from the mid to long-term perspective, how can these also help the industry to grow stronger, and to, even as we looked at the various impacts from the pandemic or even climate change, we view that all these various trade agreements are crucial even as we move forward. And next slide. Okay, so some background to today's guidebook launch. And as the title has suggested, we would be focusing on preferential market access for the food and beverage sector, and primarily we would like to present what are some of the key steps for businesses to know how to avail the tariff savings under the various free trade agreements in the region. So as a quick background, like we have seen like various types of FTAs that are coming up. But however, we view that unless a company or a business understands how to maneuver the various requirements, and knowing like what are the requirements from the various like importing or exporting markets, a company may not be able to tap into the benefits or the advantages. So this guidebook, it's really to serve as like a it provides a step-by-step approach, and it's I had a look at it, and it's very relatively simple to digest, and with and we intentionally included some case studies as well, so that it's easier for our users to understand and to see how it applies into your company's product. So that's really the intention, and we do hope that this guidebook could help as many companies as possible. And we would be also circulating the guidebook after today's webinar. And I believe that you should be able to see on your panel as well on the right, but in case you don't see the handout, not to worry, we'll still be sharing the presentation and as well as the report after today's webinar. All right, I think this may be my last slide. Why not you click onto the next one? Yeah, so right now I would just pass the time to Mayus but before that, let me quickly introduce her. Mayus is an international trade expert, and she has almost 17 years of experience on international trade negotiations and policies, and in particular on advancing trade and development initiatives, expansion of market access, leveraging trade facilitation tools, and also FTAs. And she's also very involved in business advocacy. So she's skilled in trade policy research and analysis, and very passionate about how to strategize and unlock trade opportunities for businesses, and to foster multi-stakeholder engagement and partnerships to help businesses of various sizes. And she has also participated in various trade negotiations. So Mayus, she has obtained her master's degree in public administration from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. And she also has a master's in international trade from the IE University from Madrid, Spain. So very experienced speaker that we have here. So I'll pass it to Mayus to take us through the content for the day.
Thanks so much, Teresa, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar. I hope after my presentation, you'd be able to have a better grasp on how FTAs would work for you, and hopefully we'll be able to help you with your other needs when it comes to utilizing the FTAs. Next slide, please. So the outline of my presentation would be what are FTAs? So this includes key benefits of FTAs for businesses, then how do FTAs make your exports more competitive, and that would cover tariff savings and increased participation in global or regional supply networks. And the last one would be how to qualify under FTAs to your firm's advantage. So that actually is the FTA guidebook that we developed for you. Next slide, please. Okay, what are FTAs? So as you all know, whenever you export or import products, you need to comply with so many things, with so many measures, trade measures. So that includes tariffs and import procedures, customs procedures, rules of origin, all those kind of things. And those are actually entailing barriers to trade. So these are hindering many of the companies to export or import their products. And these trade measures, they actually also entail costs for businesses. So every time you need to comply with all these trade measures, it also equates to costs for you. And costs not only in terms of monetary costs, but also in terms of the time. And can you just click on the next? Next, please. Okay, so FTA, as Teresa has highlighted, is a legally binding agreement between two or more countries to reduce or eliminate trade barriers in order to facilitate the cross-border movement of goods and services between FTA parties. Although, of course, for this guidebook, we'll be focusing on the cross-border movement of goods, so merchandise trade. So here you can see legally binding agreement, and then reduce or eliminate trade barriers. Next slide, please. So those are the two key things that's very important when it comes to FTAs. So key benefits of FTAs for businesses. Businesses can use FTAs or even other preferential schemes like the generalized system of preferences as a strategy to be more competitive and grow in overseas markets. So these FTAs are strategy for you. So it provides greater transparency, stability, and predictability of trading partners because of the legally binding nature of FTAs. This means that the countries or parties to the agreement, once they sign the agreement and implement the agreement, there is always this concept of no backtracking, meaning they cannot increase their tariffs whenever they committed to lower their tariffs. And then it also improves the market access on a more level playing field because the trade barriers have been reduced. And of course, that would eventually lead to you reducing your costs as well. So of course, FTAs, as you know, they also include trade facilitative components that help goods be cleared faster and more efficiently. This is very important for F&B products. So simplified trade procedures, advanced rulings, self-certification, single window, authorized economic operators. The FTAs, especially the modern FTAs, cover all these trade facilitative components. Next slide, please. So how do FTAs make products more cost competitive? I think many of you, probably many of the companies, there's this misnomer that the FTAs would only be more beneficial for importers, not exporters. However, if you notice, can you just proceed with the... So although the FTAs eliminate or reduce import duties, so here you can see that since FTAs eliminate or reduce import duties, that equates to tariff savings, right? And then import duty, sales tax, VAT, excise tax. and these are all paid by importers, so customs authority in the importing country. That's why many exporters would say, oh, if we're gonna apply for FTAs, only the importer would benefit from the FTAs. However, you need to understand that if the FTA that you are utilizing would equate to more competitive pricing for you, because it reduces the cost for your importer, meaning your products would be more price competitive to your importer, especially when your product doesn't have any FTAs for your other competitors in other countries. So meaning, if for instance your importer would be able to reduce their cost because of the reduction or elimination of import duties, it means that they will also be able to have a more competitive price in the destination market. That means that they'll probably the possibility of them buying from you as the exporter would also increase. So it doesn't mean that because the FTAs only eliminates import duties, that it is only beneficial for importers. It means that as an exporter, they will keep on buying from you or probably even increase their purchase from you. Next slide, please. Yeah. So FTAs increase the price competitiveness of a product through tariff savings. So for instance, here's an example, a Singaporean company exporting chocolate bars to other ASEAN countries. So here we have the HS code, and then the product description, chocolate, let's just say chocolate bars. So when you export your products to Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, or Vietnam, you need to pay for these very high MFN rates. You can see for Indonesia, for instance, it's 10%, for Malaysia, it's 15%, for Thailand, 10%, and Vietnam, 20%. And this applied MFN rate doesn't mean that they will not, that these countries will not increase the MFN rate, because in the WTO, the countries usually, the WTO members usually have the bound rates, meaning if their bound rate, for instance, for Indonesia, if their bound rate is 50%, Indonesia can actually increase their MFN tariff up to 50%. And because that's the commitment that they offered under the WTO agreement, then they can easily do that. Unlike if it's under the ASEAN FTA, or what we call the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, because all ASEAN countries have committed to lower or eliminate their duties for chocolate bars to 0%. So now you have 0%. And since there's no backtracking, they have committed that they will not backtrack their commitments. So countries will not easily be able to increase their duties unless they encounter some economic situation difficulties in their countries. But even so, if they do that, they will actually encounter some compensation requirements. So countries can ask them, can mandate them to compensate on behalf of that increase. That's why it's very important that you use the FTA, not only because of the tariff savings, but also because of the predictability and stability. So here, Indonesia, and from the 10% MFN rate under the ATIGA, you only have to pay 0%. So the margin of preference is 10%. So if your export value is 1 million, then the potential tariff savings of your buyer is 100,000 US dollars. And then you can see here for Malaysia, since the margin of preference is 15%, so potential tariff savings is 150,000 US dollars. And then with Vietnam, 20% margin of preference. So that means that the potential tariff savings for you or your buyer is 200,000 US dollars. And as you can see, the higher the trade value, the more tariff savings that you can get. So even if you say that you're only exporting 100,000 US dollars trade value to other ASEAN countries, but then if you keep on exporting the products, you're actually also accumulating tariff savings. Because once you apply for the FTA, the subsequent applications to use the FTA scheme would be easier. Next slide, please. Then also FTAs allow businesses to participate in global supply networks through availing multiple FTAs. So when you use the FTAs, it doesn't mean that you can only use one. You can actually use multiple FTAs. That's why it's very important to know if, for instance, your raw materials, you can import that from other countries using an FTA. That would already help you reduce your cost. And then also check if when you export your products after processing the raw materials in a specific country, if you would be also able to avail FTAs with that specific country. So here, a Philippine company imports fresh king salmon from New Zealand. This is a real story, and I'm sharing this because it is one of their strategies. So a Philippine company imports fresh king salmon from New Zealand, and as we all know, the salmon from New Zealand, in terms of quality, it's really good. And then they process the salmon, the raw salmon, into a smoked salmon. Then the smoked salmon is exported to countries like Singapore, Thailand, China, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. So you can see, so they import raw king salmon from New Zealand using the ANSFATA scheme, and then they process it, and then they export smoked salmon from the Philippines to Singapore, Thailand, China, Japan, South Korea, and Australia using other FTAs as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so how to qualify for FTA tariff concessions? We have identified 5 main steps towards availing FTA tariff concessions. So this one, once you follow, you'll be able to follow these steps. You can actually apply this to all of your products. So for instance, step 1, check the country of manufacture and export destination of your product. That's very important because you need to know whether the country, the exporting country, has an FTA with the importing country. And then step 2, you need to know the correct tariff classification of your product in the destination market. It's not enough that you only know the HS code of your product in the exporting country. What's important is for you to know the tariff classification of your product in the importing country, because most of the time countries have what they call their national tariff classification, tariff nomenclature, which is beyond the HS code. HS code is at the 6-digit level. So most of the time, countries would have tariff nomenclature that are beyond the 6-digit level. For instance, in ASEAN, they have the 8-digit tariff nomenclature, which they call the ASEAN Harmonized Tariff Nomenclature. Then the third step is ensure that the product is offered tariff concessions under the FTA. This one, you need to make sure that your product, your specific product, which is based on the tariff nomenclature, tariff classification, is actually can enjoy the tariff concession under the FTA. There are instances where a tariff line is excluded, or they are categorized as sensitive or highly sensitive products. So this means that they'll probably be excluded from tariff concession under the FTA, or in terms of the final rate for sensitive and highly sensitive categories, usually they only reach a certain level of end rate. So I think, for instance, in ASEAN China, when you say highly sensitive product, the final rate is 20%, while for sensitive products, the final rate is 5%. But then again, if you compare it with the MFN rates, usually the the margin of preference is substantial. Then step 4, check the origin criteria of the good and determine if it is compliant with the rules of origin under the FTA. So we need to make sure that your product is originating. So that means it's compliant with the prescribed origin criteria for your product. Then step 5 is to comply with the documentation required. So this includes either you need to apply for a certificate of origin, or in some instances, they call it the self-declaration or self-certification. Next slide, please. Okay, so for step 1, so check the country of manufacture and export destination for your product. So which country are you exporting your good to? Is there an existing FTA with that country? The country where the good is manufactured and the export destination or country must be parties of a common FTA, which I just highlighted a while ago. Then if a manufactured good will be exported to an intermediate country before being re-exported to the final importing country, all 3 parties, one country in which the good is manufactured, to the intermediate country, and the importing country must be members or parties of a common FTA. So you need to take that into consideration. So the country in which the good is manufactured, and then the intermediate country and the importing country, they all must be parties or members of common FTA. Next slide, please. So here, I just put some examples. So Singapore, Malaysia, Singapore exporting products to Malaysia, for instance, you can use the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement or any other ASEAN +1 FTAs, because Singapore and Malaysia are both members of ASEAN and parties to the ATIGA, ASEAN +1 FTAs, and of course the RCEP. Although of course you need to see whether that ASEAN country is already implementing the RCEP. In I think Philippines, Indonesia, and Myanmar at the moment are still not using the RCEP. And then the second one, Philippines, Thailand, India, ASEAN-India FTA, you can use that. The only problem with the RCEP, although it is being implemented, and we thought India would be part of it, but eventually they opted out or backed out. Yeah, so you can only use the ASEAN-India FTA. Then the third one, China, Vietnam, Korea. So of course, you have now the RCEP, which you can use. All of these 3 countries are already implementing the RCEP, and then the fourth one is Vietnam, Singapore, Canada, and again, and these are all parties to the CPTPP. So you can check whether you can comply with the CPTPP and use that one. Next slide. Okay, step 2. So I'm just going through the steps one by one to explain it or elaborate it further. So determine the HS code of your product, or the product classification, your product classification. So again, the HS classification of goods is an international nomenclature at the 6-digit level developed by the World Customs Organization for the classification of goods. ASEAN, as I've mentioned, uses the ASEAN Harmonized Tariff Nomenclature, or AHTN, which is harmonized at the 8-digit level across all 10 ASEAN countries. Then HS codes are required in the permit declaration of goods to determine the tariffs, controls, and rules of origin applicable to the goods. They are also used for the collection of trade statistics. And I've mentioned a while ago, most of the time, countries would have their own national tariff nomenclature, which can go beyond the 8-digit level as well. I think, for instance, Japan, not sure if until 10 or 12, same with China. So you need to make sure that you also know the national tariff nomenclature of that importing country for your specific product. Next slide, please. Then chapter 3, check for FTA preferential tariff. So can your product enjoy tariff concessions under the FTA scheme? So you need to ensure that your good is not excluded from preferential treatment. So here, as you can see, for instance, if you're exporting copra meal to ASEAN countries, so you can see that this is included in the ATIGA. However, for the ASEAN India, it is excluded, meaning India will not offer you tariff concession under the FTA. So they will be using the MFN rate. And because we have the reciprocity principle under FTAs, ASEAN FTAs, this means that if a country has excluded the product and in the tariff concession and the tariff schedule, so they will also not be able to avail the tariff concession that the other party has offered under the FTA. So if India, for instance, would want to export their product, the copra meal, to other ASEAN countries, they will not be offered the tariff concessions or the AIFTA rates that these ASEAN countries have offered under the FTA because India has put it under the exclusion list. So that's what we call the reciprocity principle. So either the MFN rate, they will impose the MFN rate, or I think there is also a category on the sensitive or highly sensitive list. So whichever is, I think they say whichever is higher. Next slide, please. So I'm putting together the steps 4 and 5 because these are the two conditions that you really need to comply with to benefit from FTAs. So you need to check the rules of origin criteria and make sure that you comply with that. So here, the key is really to understand the rules of origin in order for you to avail the preferential tariffs under the FTAs. So they have this what they call the principle of the products must be originating, or this means that products to be exported to an FTA party must comply with the origin criterion specified under the specified FTA. And please note this. So each product has a different origin criterion per FTA. So it's not because under the ASEAN, for instance, ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, it's RVC 40%, then don't expect that under the ASEAN China, it's also RVC 40%. You need to make sure that you check the specific origin criterion per FTA. It's the same thing with when you classify your products. So you classify the products, you have different tariff classification per product. So the second one is to comply when you figure out or you determine that you are compliant with the rules of origin criteria or your product is originating under the FTA, then what you need to do is to prove to the competent authorities that your product satisfies the ROO requirement under the specific FTA. So we have two ways of proving that your product is compliant or originating. So the first one is through a certificate of origin, and the second one is through self-declaration or self-certification. So the form is a declaration of the exporter to be certified by the relevant issuing authority that the product complies with the origin criterion requirement. So the exporter must comply, properly accomplish. It's very important that you properly accomplish the forms to avoid delays of shipments or worse, rejection by customs authority. So the problem is with customs authorities. What they do is whenever they see something wrong in your certificate of origins, and I think it's not only on the certificate of origins, but all the customs documentation in general, but more so for the certificate of origin. Why? Because you're applying for a lower tariff or zero. In some cases, it's even at 0%. This means that they're actually foregoing revenue. That's why they're very critical when it comes to certificate of origins. And that's the reason why you need to make sure that all your entries in the certificate of origin are correct and you follow. Usually they have the guidelines or the requirements on how to fill in the certificate of origin. You need to make sure that you follow all those rules. Otherwise, they can say that, oh, you're not compliant. And that's only in the case of the certificate of origin, not even the ROO itself or the other requirements. Yeah. So, and you need also to note that each FTA uses different CO form, especially in ASEAN FTA. So, for the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, for instance, they call it the CO Form D. And then for ASEAN Korea FTA, they call it CO Form AK. Then CO Form AI for the ASEAN India FTA. Then CO Form RCEP for RCEP agreement. For ASEAN China FTA, they call it CO Form D, Form E, sorry, because it was implemented right after the ASEAN FTA. And ASEAN FTA, they're using D. That's why the ASEAN China FTA, they call it the CO. They're calling the CO Form E. Then for the ASEAN Australia New Zealand, it's called CO Form AA and Z. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here I'm just gonna mention because we recently had a webinar for the FNB sector on the RCEP agreement, like the benefits of RCEP agreement to the FNB sector. So here are examples of liberal product specific rules for FNB products under RCEP over existing ASEAN FTAs. So you can see here at butter, for instance, in RCEP, it's RVC 40 or change in chapter, whereas in the ASEAN Korea, it's wholly obtained. Then for ASEAN China FTA, it's regional value content 40, RVC 40. And then for AJCEP, it's change in chapter. Why do they say that this is more liberal under the RCEP? Because of the word or. So it means that the rules of origin for butter under the RCEP is a co-equal rule. So you either use the RVC 40 or the change in chapter. So it depends on which origin criterion would actually be easier for you to comply with. And then grated or powdered cheese, for instance, on RVC 40 or change in tariff subheading. Then again, for ASEAN Korea, it's wholly obtained, meaning you need to source all your raw materials or inputs from Korea or from other ASEAN countries. You cannot have it done from other countries because it's wholly obtained. Then ASEAN China RBC 40 again, then AJCEP, it's changed in chapter. So again, you can see RVC 40 or CTSH, meaning it's a co-equal rule. So you either choose RVC 40 or change in tariff subheading. I'm not gonna go through everything for this one, but Teresa will be circulating these slides anyway, so you can take a look later. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's just the step-by-step guide in availing FTA tariff concession. So you need to know which current country are you exporting the good to. Is there an existing FTA with that country? What is the FTA you wish to utilize? There are instances where you need to choose between two or more. So you need to make sure that that you check whether which one would provide you the better preferential tariffs, as well as you need to ensure that it's easier for you to comply with the rules of origin requirement. Then once you know what FTA you wish to utilize, then establish the tariff classification of the good. Then ensure that the good is not excluded from the preferential treatment, because it doesn't make sense for you to use the FTA if it's excluded from the tariff concessions. And then check the origin criteria or criterion for the good, and then determine if your good qualifies as an originating good, and then check the consignment conditions, and then check the documentation required. Yeah, so I think that's it. Okay, so again, just to highlight that businesses must use FTAs as a strategy to be more competitive and grow in overseas markets. There are instances where you probably don't see yet how the FTAs would benefit your exports or imports. You can actually look at it, especially for instance the RCEP agreement, because there are, I think, still most of the tariff lines, and it's still better to use the ASEAN FTAs, ASEAN +1 FTAs, or the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, or probably even the bilateral FTAs. But in the long term, you would probably benefit from the RCEP, because over time the tariff rates under RCEP will go down for the products. So they have this usually in like 10-20 years phasing out of tariffs. So you need to check that. Also, you need to see whether your importation of your raw materials, you can also apply for FTA concessions. Again, the FTAs, they usually provide substantial tariff savings. And then it also provide you more transparent, stable, and predictable trade environment. The only thing is really to understand the rules of origin for your specific product. And then, as I always say, whenever you apply or utilize the FTA, it's always hard to do it at first, because you don't know. You need to obtain all the information. You need to gather all information which you may not know, and then you also need to prove to the competent authority prior to your exportation that your product is originating, and apply for the certificate of origin, or even be considered as a certified exporter to be able to use the self-declaration or self-certification scheme. However, once you manage to do that during the first shipment, it's easier actually to do it for the subsequent shipments, because in customs they have this notion of risk management, wherein whenever a company has a good track record, past history record of importing their products, usually the subsequent exportations, importations, they won't really be very critical of you anymore. Yeah. So that's it. Yeah, so if you have any questions, let us know.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mayus, for taking us through the key steps in utilizing FTA. And I think it really depends on the types of business and the products that businesses are handling or importing or exporting, in order to know which FTA to leverage on. And considering that that's really a wide range of FTAs, I think what's key is for companies to really understand the features of each FTA and to decide which FTA would give the most benefit to the company. And I do agree that it's indeed a strategy, and in fact, like a company specific kind of like company, like it's unique to each company, like what kind of like FTA that you want to leverage on. So there's not really like a one size fit all, and really depends on your size and the key markets that you're interested in. So yeah, thank you very much, Mayus. And I think we are now at the time of Q&A. So to our participants who are on the webinar today, so if let's say you have any questions for Mayus, can be like pertaining to your company's import-export activities, or it could be related to like NTMs, please feel free to submit your questions to Mayus using the feature on the panel that you could see on your screen. You can just type it in, submit it to us, and we'll be able to capture that. So while we are waiting for questions from our participants, maybe I thought I can just start with some questions from my end, more from like a broader perspective, and just trying to understand beyond what Mayus has shared as well during the past half an hour or so. So my question would be, like Mayus, you had a lot of experience dealing with the public sector and also the private sector in terms of guiding them like how to use FTA. So I'm just curious to understand, based on your observation, what are the key challenges that are faced by the public sector in the process of developing FTAs? And on the other hand, what are the key challenges that you have observed from the private sector's point of view in that process of utilizing FTA. So yeah, just from these two sides, and hope to hear some perspectives from that.
Thanks, thanks, Teresa. Yeah, I came from both sides. So I used to be a trade negotiator for the Philippines for over 9 years, and I know how hard it is to actually negotiate FTAs. It's difficult in a sense that you need to make sure that whatever position you take to the table, it's aligned with your stakeholders' interest. So stakeholders, as you'll know, in most countries, especially developing and least developed countries, on when it comes, for instance, for tariffs, tariffs provide them a source of revenue. So when they lower the import duties, it means that they're foregoing revenue, which they need to fund social services, roads, healthcare sector, education, those kind of things. That's why it's always hard for them to commit. Um, and probably you've heard this many times that FTAs most of the time, especially in ASEAN, they're not the deep level kind of FTAs. Most of the time, it's it's like superficial. It's basically because it's hard for them to forego revenue, and there's no way for them to assess how the FTA would somehow benefit the entire country in the long term. They don't have a way of assessing the socioeconomic impact of FTAs. So did the FTA provide them with more jobs, more income? And did the FTA help them with the poverty alleviation? And probably most of the time it's not, because the domestic industries would probably be not that competitive. So and then of course, like they would just decide to close down, and then you have more imports rather than more exports, unless of course the FTA would help them to have more investments, foreign direct investments. That means that, of course, when a company, especially if a big company, manufacturing company, relocates into a country, then that would then create jobs, quality jobs, more income opportunities for the nationals of that country. But most of the time, especially developing and least developed countries, it's hard for them to do those things. So it's not easy. So just probably for you to have an idea on how difficult it is for countries to negotiate FTAs. And they have a lot of things to consider, including the interests of their domestic industries. That's why you always hear about protectionism. That's correct. And if these industries that are lobbying the government, they're really the big fishes, big players in the domestic market, it's hard for them to say no. Yeah, that's a reality. It entails politics as well. And then in terms of companies, private sector benefiting from the FTAs, for me, there are two key challenges that companies are facing. The first one, especially if you're a small company, first one, not knowing about FTAs. This is a reality. So whenever I was talking before, so after negotiating FTAs, and then I would go and talk to the businesses and then ask them, oh, are you using the FTAs? The reply would be, what is an FTA? It's the first time we hear about the FTA. So that's one, not knowing about the FTA. And then not just not knowing about FTA, but where to get the FTAs, like the information that they need to be able to understand the FTAs, and how which specific provisions, for instance, it's very legal, it's very technical, so it's always hard for companies to digest the FTAs. They don't even know where to go, which website to go to, which government agency to go to get all this information. So it's really lack of awareness and understanding on the benefits of FTAs. Second one is the technicality of complying with the rules of origin criteria. So because of the technicality, the complexity. So even for me, it took me many years to be able to understand rules of origin. More so for companies that it's the first time that they're encountering, or probably just knowing about the rules of origin, and then under the rules of origin, there's a lot of criteria. And then even for each criterion, there's a lot of technicalities in there. Yeah, so it's the technicality complexity of the rules of origin requirement.
Yeah, thanks, Mayas. Yeah, I think that's really good to hear from both sides and what are some of the concerns. And I think these would be helpful for us as well. Like I mean, like FIA and AFBA, even as we continue to engage with our stakeholders from be it the private sector and the public sector in terms of understanding what's in their mind even as they go through these trade negotiations, and what would be the best approach forward in terms of how do we table our key concerns and in terms of the interest of the food sector. And so my next question would be that we know that FTAs go through like a regular review every few years. So so from your point of view, what would be the areas that can be further strengthened or improved, or any kind of new provisions that you have seen in the relatively more recent FTAs that you feel that it's which is more advanced, like something that's new to the FTA, the whole FTA picture, like something that's needed in order for this to continue to be a useful instrument to businesses.
Yeah, I think the RCEP, the RCEP contains a lot of trade facilitative schemes that are not available in other ASEAN FTAs. So, for instance, the advanced rulings in 3 areas. So, rules of origin, tariff classification, customs valuation, and they also have this expedited customs clearance, which I understand that they adopted from the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. I thought that would be very useful for the F&B sector, given that the F&B products are highly perishable. So that would actually reduce cost for companies, as well as make sure that the quality of the product of the F&B products are maintained. And then I think it's not this one. It's not, you cannot find it in RCEP or any other FTAs, but it's been on the table for quite some time now. The full cumulation, meaning you can source raw materials or inputs from other countries not part of the FTAs, as long as you substantially process the product in the FTA country or FTA party. Then they can comply with the rules of origin criteria and then be able to use or avail the preferential tariffs. It's been discussed in the Fair Trade in Goods Agreement, in the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA, the RCEP, they also attempted to do that. However, only the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement provide the partial cumulation. I think they allow 20% or below to be outsourced from non-FTA parties. But other than that, yeah, there's none. And then I think in terms of the non-tariff measures, this is very important for the F&B sector. So the RCEP, it's more substantial in terms of the provisions there, the commitments provided by the parties, RCEP parties. So probably these are the things that they can adapt. Even the sectoral initiative, right? They have sectoral initiative so that they don't have to apply all the more liberal rules to all the sectors, but rather only those sectors that are essential. In the case of F&B products, for instance, and it is essential. It is considered an essential sector to ensure food security.
Yeah, thanks, Mayes, for that perspective. I don't have further questions, so I think that will be all for the Q&A. And I think for our participants today, if let's say you have any follow-up questions that you didn't get to raise it during this webinar, just feel free to reach out to the Secretariat, myself, or I think Mayes, you have your contact as well on the slides, right? So yeah, feel free to get in touch with any of us, and we can certainly help to see how we could help you with your questions regarding your business. So I still have, I think, 1 or 2 slides just to wrap up today's session and just to give an update to participants and members who are on the call today, just to let you know what will be the next steps moving forward and how do we plan to move forward in terms of our agenda around trade. So I mentioned about the regional trade development report, monitoring report. So that will continue on, like on a monthly basis. We do circulate these reports to those who are on a mailing list. So if let's say you're interested to receive that, you can let me know as well, and we can add you in onto the list so that you can get it in your inbox. So that's something that we'll continue on. And secondly, in terms of awareness building and capacity building, which is the intent of today's webinar, which is to reach out to businesses to help them with the process of utilizing FTAs. And we're also keen to understand what's your experience in terms of using FTAs, because in our conversations with the trade ministries, they are also quite keen to find out more about what's the current ongoing challenges that businesses face on the ground, be it pre-border, at the border, or even post-border. So that's a conversation that we hope to continue to have with our industry partners, such as the National Industry Associations in the ASEAN region. And I think those specific case studies would be really helpful for us even as we communicate these to the trade negotiators or the other like ministerial bodies. And thirdly, I mentioned about addressing NTMs and also some of the specific trade challenges. So we do see some openings in certain markets whereby there's opportunities for stakeholder engagement. And also, for example, currently RCEP is going through that implementation process, and it has come into force like since 1st January, and just waiting for a few more countries to ratify it. So, and Maya's mentioned about a potential sectoral initiative that would be launch in the near future, which is part of the provisions under RCEP. So that's something that we are keeping an eye as well, because like they have not gone into the details which sector would be on the priority list. But from our point of view, we would like to support food industry as one of the sectors to be prioritized in terms of looking deeper into addressing non-tariff measures. And also in the past 2 years, we had also learned how it's important for the food sector as a whole to be treated as essential rather than on a tariff line basis. So that's something that we are also carrying forward in terms of our conversations with the various stakeholders. And last but not least, the advancement of the harmonization agenda, which would remain as the mid to long-term agenda for both FIA and AFBA as well. That while we, on one hand, we look at the tariff saving components, but on the other hand, we are aware that unless like NTMs are addressed, like it will continue to hinder the full benefits that comes from the FTAs. So these are things that we would carry forward in the next couple of months, as well as in the next year or so, even as we continue to build up our expertise around these areas. And we will continue to welcome feedback as well at any point of time, such that we are able to understand what's the latest status and we can take all this into account. So with that, it's 3 o'clock here, and we would bring the webinar to a close. And again, like the slides and the guidebook will be sent to all of you after the webinar today. So just keep a lookout on your email. So thank you again for your time, and I hope to see you in the next webinar that we'll organize. Thank you very much.